Thank you for inviting me to come back again and to worship with you today and to share with you a message from God's Word. Always a pleasure to be back here, be back home, so to speak, just about it. Spent quite a few years out here, so it's always good to be back. And good to see you here this morning. Have your Bibles, turn with it to the first book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I want you to think about the idea never face a giant with your mouth closed. Never face a giant with your mouth closed. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. I'm going to back up to Genesis chapter 1. And in that first chapter of Genesis, we know it talks about the creation of heaven and earth. And think about, well, what was the first thing God created? And if you look at verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So maybe He created heaven first, then earth, in that order. And then when you get down to verse 2 and following verses where it talks about individual things that He created here on the earth, in the universe and all. And we know the first thing it says He created, there was light. It says in verse 2 that everything was darkness, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the water there and in the face of the darkness. And in verse 3 it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So light was the first thing He created, but was it? Maybe sound was the first thing He created. Think about this a minute. When did the light appear? Only after the voice of God said, let there be light. What does it say? And God said, let there be light. And the light didn't appear until God said that. So the voice of God, as it went out across this universe and this darkness and blackness and chaos that was there at the time, the light was created. If you go down to every one of the things in verse 6, it said, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. And then verse 9, God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together. And on through to everything like that. And preceding every one of those things, it says, and God said, and then whatever God said, then it occurred. Shows us the importance of sound, the importance of speaking, the importance of hearing, throughout the Bible, not just here in Genesis, but throughout the Bible, we find it so important to that sound is always associated with God and our relationship to God. Many times when you look at the Bible, you'll see the presence of God. There's always a lot of noise around it. Sometimes a noisy event. There's shouting. There's noise of all kind. There's sounds of all kind. Lots of it. There's thunder sometimes. Raging winds sometimes. But there's noise associated with the presence of God and being in the presence of God. On the day of Pentecost, the people there were so filled with the Spirit and they were making so much noise, people thought they were drunk, didn't they? So this is a noisy time there for them. And nothing was created until God said something, and then it was created. And He kind of passed that on down to Adam, really, in a way. You remember when all the things had been created, the animals had been created, and He brought the animals before Adam, and He said, whatever you call them, that's what they are. That's a dog, that's a cow, that's a horse, whatever. We still call them that, don't we? But we didn't call them that till Adam said that. So again, we see something, the importance of the voice and speaking out speaking up and speaking out for things. And we see the importance of sound and speaking and hearing and listening. When I was looking at this information here a few weeks ago, I thought, I don't know how many times the word says or said occurs in the Bible. So I thought I'd do a Google search, and find it. It didn't do any good. So I pulled out my old Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Mr. Gene, I know you know what that is. Most of you might do as well. It's a book about this thick, about that high, and about that wide. And every single word in the Bible is in that book in alphabetical order and tells you every time, and it shows you every book of the Bible, every script, every verse of the Bible in which that word appears. Every A, every I, it's that detail. So I looked up the word, says or said, and I flipped over there, and there's 2 pages of it, and I flipped another page, there's 2 more pages. I said, good grief, I can't count all these. So I took my pen out and just kind of measured down the page, and so there was 27 references from there to there, So then I started going like this down the pages to see how many of them it take. And when I ended up there, there's somewhere around 4,020 times in the Bible that the word said occurs. And if you add the corollary to that, the word hear, and do the same thing with that, then you find out when you add those 2 together, there are somewhere approximately 7,800 times in the Bible that there's words as he said, says, hear, heard, whatever. We think about our sight sometimes being our most important sense. But the word see and the word saw, I looked those up too. See occurs 600 times, saw occurs 600 times, 1,200 times only when you combine the word see and saw together in the Bible. And almost 8,000 times it's talking about speaking and hearing. Faith cometh by how? Hearing. Not by what you see. If I can see something, I don't really have to have faith that I see it. I know it's there. But our faith comes by hearing, we're told. So the importance then of hearing, the importance of hearing what God says, the importance of what we say and what we speak to ourselves when we talk to ourselves or when we talk to one another or we hear other people talking. Our sound and our voice is important, and the things we say is important. And no faith is required without, if you see something, but you got to hear it. And this is the way God works. we hear things from God first, and then we see things take place. We hear God speak to us and telling us to do something, and then but it doesn't occur until after we've heard it and after we've gone and done what God has said we're supposed to do. I think about the blind man. One of them, anyway, that was healed by Jesus. Jesus was the last week of his life. He's on his way to Jerusalem. They go into Jericho on the way to Jerusalem. And as they're entering Jericho, there's a man sitting there by the road that was blind. He's been begging and been sitting there begging, as was the custom for people that were blind and so forth and couldn't work and do things. That was customary for them to be there, maybe close to the gates of the city. And he hears people every day passing by. And this one day, he hears something he's never heard before. He hears a crowd of people, bunches of people. He can probably hear them walking on the gravel, maybe talking, maybe some of them singing, whistling or whatever, and talking to one another. And something's going on. So he asks somebody that's there that could see, what's going on? And he said, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And he immediately knew who Jesus of Nazareth was. He had never seen him, may have never heard him speak. But when he heard somebody say, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by, this man said, oh, Son of David, have mercy on me. And they said, be quiet. You know what he did? He said louder, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then Jesus stopped the whole procession there and said, bring that man to me. And he probably heard Jesus say, bring him to me. And then he heard Jesus say, what do you want me to do for you? He said, Lord, I may receive my sight. And after he heard Jesus say, what do you want me to do for you? And after he said, Lord, I want to receive my sight, what happened? He received his sight. He heard that first before he ever saw him. He heard of Jesus, and he heard Jesus speak to him before he ever saw Jesus. And that was the same way with us, that we hear about Jesus and we hear Jesus speak to us before we see Jesus in our life, don't we? Regardless of when Jesus came into our life. We heard about him first. We heard somebody tell us about Jesus Christ. And it's still the same way today. We need to tell people about Jesus Christ. They need to hear us talking about Jesus and what Jesus can do and so forth. You go back to Noah. God told Noah to build an ark. An ark? There was never an ark built before. Noah didn't know what an ark was. Didn't know what it looked like. There was no photograph of an ark to look at or drawing of an ark or plans to go by. But you heard God tell him to build an ark, and then you heard God give him the instructions on how to build the ark and what to build it out of and what size to make it. And after you followed God's instructions, there was the ark. People could see it. But a lot of people thought he was very foolish, didn't they? Can you imagine the taunting that he must have gotten over the years and over the time he was building that ark out there. You know, you're out here on dry land. There's no water. You building an ark. You know, that's foolish. But you know what? God's ways are foolish to people that don't know him, aren't they? A lot of times. The things that God tells us are things we should be doing, that looks like foolishness to the person that doesn't know Jesus Christ. The person's not following Christ. They think that's foolish. They think what God says is foolish. You know, and so I think it's, I don't know, I believe I'd rather be foolish for the Lord than to do some of the things the world thinks is right and go that way and then end up going the wrong way, wouldn't you? I mean, call me a fool for Christ. I don't care. I don't want to follow what he says. Just one little thing, you know, we talk about getting money, for example, or acquiring property or whatever. The world says, you know, to have more, you got to get more. To have more money, you got to get more money. To have more land, you got to buy more land. This kind of thing. The Bible says just the opposite, doesn't it? Give, and what will happen? It'll be given back to you. Pressed down, running over. It's giving. To the world, that's foolish. How are you going to keep anything if you're giving it away? Well, you see, the things that God tells us sometimes may seem foolishness to the world. But we know if we follow God, what God tells us and what we hear God say, we know if we follow that way, it's going to be the right way. And things are going to turn out greater than we even thought it was going to turn out, maybe. When you get over to the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel, where I asked you to turn to a minute ago there, this reiterates what we've said about God doesn't lead us by what we see. God leads us by what we hear and what he tells us and what we hear from him. And we got to speak out what we know is God's will. And we got to speak God's will before we can see whatever it is that he wants us to do and whatever it is he's trying to get us to do. We know the story of David and Goliath, and that's what's here in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. And we know that Saul's army of Israel was camped on one side of the valley and the Philistines on the other side of the valley, not very far apart. They could hear one another across over there. And they had this giant Goliath in the Philistine army. And the Bible talks about how heavy his armor was and how big his spear was and all these kind of things. And had a shield bearer that carried a shield in front of him and all the armor you had on, this kind of stuff. You know, it explains all that and tells us all that. And they had been camped out there for a number of days, at least 40 days when this was taking place. And Goliath steps out there every day, without fail, every day. Goliath walks out there in front of the Israeli army across the valley from them there. He walks out there and he starts his little spiel, you know, about what he's going to do to them and so forth. And he you know, tells them, you know, I challenge you, sins. I'm the Philistine. You're Saul's army. Send me one man out. Just send one man out here. And if I beat him, we take everything. If he wins, y'all can have everything. Just send him out here, you know. And when they heard this voice of Goliath going across this valley, their reaction was that they were afraid, weren't they? They cowered away from this one man standing there talking. They cowered away from him, and they didn't want anything to do with him or go out to do battle with him or whatever. You know, they didn't want anything like that at all. And the Philistine giant said, I defy the armies of Israel. This is in verse 10 of chapter 17. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that may fight together. And verse 11 said, when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed. They were greatly afraid because of what they had heard this man say. One day, David, his dad, sent him out because David had 3 brothers in Saul's army. So he sent David out one day, and David's just a teenager, young man. Sent David out to check on his brothers, see if they were doing okay. And he sent some food with him to give to the brothers and to the captain of the army that was there. So he sends them out there to check on his brothers and so forth and take some food. And while David's there, Goliath steps out again on the other side of the valley, like he had always done, and carried out his little daily spiel to them about, send me somebody out here to fight me. I'm defying you, and I'm defying your army. Send somebody out here. And verse 23 says, and as David talked with the men there, and as it says, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spoke according to the same words that he'd been speaking every time. And David heard him. And verse 23:4 says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him. And they were afraid, very afraid. And so David asked, what's going on here? Who's this man over there making all this noise and all this racket? And verse 25 says, and the men of Israel said, have you seen this man that's coming? Have you seen him before, David? Well, he hadn't seen Goliath. He hadn't been out there before. And he said, surely he's come to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him and with great riches, and give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said, wait, what'd you say? Repeat that. And David said to the men that stood by him, say, what's going to be done for the man that kills Goliath? And of course they repeated it, what they just told him. And then listen to what David says now. From here on out, listen to what David says. Look at David's approach to this giant that's in front of him. And whatever giant we're facing in our life, whether it be a financial giant or a health giant or whatever it might be, job related, it doesn't matter what it is, whatever it is. Look at David's attitude. Look at what David did. Look at what David said. Hear what David said as he approached Goliath. In verse 26 it says, and David says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? Notice David starts out, he didn't say, who's this person defiling Saul's army? He said, who is this person defiling the army of the living God? David starts out by proclaiming God. This is God's fight. This is God's army. Who's this one defying the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And they repeat, what they just told him about everything that's going to take place for the person that kills him. And verse 32, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fall because of him. Thy servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. I'll take care of him. Y'all don't cower, don't be afraid. I'll take care of him. Now, picture this now. Here's this giant of a man over there with all this armor on and his sword and his spears and a shield bearer right in front of him. And here's David, just a boy, in his shepherd's clothes. A little pouch, they could put some rocks in and his wooden staff. And that's all he had. And his sling, of course. And David said, I'll go out there and fight him. And Saul said to David, you aren't able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're just a boy. He's a man of war from his youth. David said, listen to David now. And David said to Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep. And there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and I smote him, and I delivered the lamb out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by the beard, and I smote him, and I slew him. I killed that lion. I killed him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Look at his attitude. Look at what David is saying to Saul. Look at the outlook he has about what's about to take place. Did he cower away? No. Well, because he knew that the living God was on his side. This man was defiling the armies of the living God, so he knew God was involved in this, and God was going to be with him. In verse 37, David said, moreover, the Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he's going to deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said, go and the Lord be with you. I wonder what Saul was thinking. I think, oh boy, go and the Lord be with you. You know, I always say it sometimes. I think, well, it's going to fail. This boy's going to get killed. But he said, go and the Lord be with you. And we remember, as Christians, wherever we go, the Lord's with us, isn't he? Whatever we're going through, the Lord's with us. David again declared, he's fighting with the living God, the armies of the living God. And then we know the story, what happened next. Saul put his armor all on David, and that didn't fit him. It was too big for him and whatever, and it was cumbersome. He said, I can't do anything in this. I can't fight like with all this stuff on. I'm not used to it, he said. So he took it all off. And he got his picked up his staff again and had his pouch on him and so forth. And in verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand, and he chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook. Now, why didn't he just pick them up on the ground somewhere? Because if you leave a stone of any kind in a stream, the current that's passing over it over a period of time is going to just smooth it off, isn't it, and round off all the rough edges on it. And David knew that if I take this smooth stone and I put it in my sling and I wind that thing up and I'm looking where I want it to go, and it's going to go right where I want it to go. But if he picked up one out there that was jagged on the edges and everything and tried to throw it, he didn't know for sure where it was going to go when it left that sling. But he could guide that smooth stone to where it needs to be. And he picked those 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had, even a scrip. And his sling was in his hand. And what? He drew near the Philistine. He headed out toward Goliath. He headed out there just with what he had. He headed toward Goliath. And then when Goliath saw who was coming out there, verse 41, and the Philistine came on and drew near to David, and the man bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, it said. For he was just a boy, a ruddy look and fair complexion. And listen what Goliath says. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that thou comest after me with staves, his staff, his wooden staff? You think you're going to run me off like running off a dog? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me. Come on out here where I am. Come to me. And I'll give your flesh to the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Can you imagine the sound of a Goliath's voice, his huge voice, as he said these things to David, and as David's still walking toward him, going toward him? But it didn't make David afraid? No, it didn't. Listen again to David's response. Then said David to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou defiled. I'm coming to you not by myself, but the whole host of God's coming out here with me. And he said to Goliath, this day will the Lord deliver you into my hands, and I'll smite you, and I'll take your head from you. He didn't have a sword. Anything to cut the Goliath's head off will. He said, I'm going to cut your head off. And he said, I'm going to take your head from you, and I'm going to give the carcass of the host of the Philistines, not just Goliath. Now look what he said. I'm going to give the carcasses of the host of all you Philistines to this day to the fowls of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. Goliath said, I won't give your skin, your hide to the birds and the beasts. He said, I'm going to give all you Philistines I'm going to feed, you're going to become feed for the birds and the wild beasts. And then he says in that same verse 4 to 6, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. You see, when there was more going on than just David and Goliath fighting here, wasn't he? The Philistines needed to know, and the Israelites needed to know, that there was a God right there. God was right there with them. The Lord of hosts was right there with them. They didn't need to be afraid. When they heard Goliath screaming across, they didn't need to be afraid. They had the Lord of hosts with them. They had God with them. And they needed to know that there was a God in Israel. And the Philistines needed to know that there was a God in Israel. And the same is true today. When things confront us and God gets us through whatever those giants are that we are facing, it's not just to get us through them, but it's to help us as individuals even to know that there's a God in Owasso. There's a God in Evergreen. There's a God wherever I live. There's a God right there. Wherever I go, wherever I am, God's right there. So he knew, and David knew that when he defeated Goliath, that not only were the Israelites going to know there was a God and not be afraid anymore, but the Philistines are going to do that too. And he said in verse 47, all this assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and with spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Notice David said whatever, he was facing this giant, but he said it's not my battle. He said this battle is the Lord's battle. And he said the Lord's going to deliver you into my hands. It's the Lord of hosts that's going with me. For the battle is the Lord's. I want you to remember something. Whatever you're facing in your life, you're not fighting alone. It's God's battle. Because when you come out victorious, you're going to be praising God and giving God the glory for what he's done. And people are going to see that in you and hear you glorifying God. And they're going to know that there's a God where they are and where you are. Because we know he's the one that gave us victory. Verse 48, it came to pass when the Philistine arose and drew near to David to meet him, that David hastened and ran toward him. When David saw him coming, he didn't cower away. He knew the Lord of hosts was on his side. He knew this was the Lord's battle. So he runs toward Goliath. Maybe he's running and making a sling the whole time, I don't know. But he's going running toward him anyway. And it says he released that stone and hit Goliath in the forehead. He fell down dead. Verse 50 says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. He smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Verse 51, therefore David ran and stood up on top of Goliath, jumped upon his body, stood on top of him, and took Goliath's own sword and drew it out of its sheath, and therefore he slew him and cut his head off with that sword. And when the Philistines saw their champion dead, they fled. Because they know one man shouldn't have been able to do this. No one should have been able to take Goliath. So there was something greater going on than this boy that came out there and faced Goliath. So you see, it doesn't matter your age. Sometimes young people can reach people you and I can't reach. Sometimes God can use young people to do things you and I can't do. And they fled, the Philistines fled. But look what happened to the men of Israel. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until they came to the valley at the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharon, even to Gath unto Ekron. The whole road was scattered with the bodies of the Philistines, just like David said he was going to do. That God was going to deliver them into his hands, and he did. So you see, we're all going to face some giants at times in our life. We've got to declare victory when we face a giant. Don't start thinking about it, and Satan's going to use this against you. Satan will use your mind against you, get you to thinking negative things about it, get you thinking, well, I can't do this, I can't do that, this is going to happen, that might happen, that's going to happen, that might happen. Get you to doubting, doesn't he? Did David doubt? No. What did he doubt in his mind? Satan's going to try to make you afraid of what's going on in your life and afraid of the situation you're in. Was David afraid? No. There's no fear in David's life, no fear in what he said whatsoever. Was there any uncertainty? Do you think David ever thought, well, I don't want to do the right thing or not? This guy's pretty good size. Do you ever think, was there any uncertainty in his life? No. He ran out there to meet him. He ran to meet that giant. Everything David said, there was no fear expressed in it. There was no doubt expressed in it. There was no uncertainty expressed in it. There was nothing negative expressed in it. And that's the approach we're going to take to our giants, knowing that the battle we're in is God's battle. And then when that battle is over and victory is won, people wherever you live and wherever you are going to know that there's a God. So don't face your giants with your mouth closed. Face it like David did. And you'll see the victory just like David did. Maybe there's something in your heart and in your life right this morning that's plaguing you and it's a giant for you. I just ask you to realize this is God's battle you're in, not just yours. You're not by yourself. And the Lord of hosts is with you, just like he was with David. Turn to him. That's your source of strength. That's your source of power. And God will get you through. If you're here this morning, you've never accepted Christ as your Savior, you got to do that. You need to make that decision this morning. We'll give you a chance to do that. If there's any decision you need to make for the Lord in any way this morning, you need to do it right now as we just sing our invitation hymn. Whether or not you come down front, it doesn't matter. You just make that decision where you are and what you need to do. And let God prevail in your life so that people know that there's a God wherever you are and wherever you go. Let's stand together. What was it, 187? Okay, number 187, okay.